Aging in general, in and of itself, is a function of change over a period of time. So even though there's lots of information that will be provided during today's education, the real general theme for you to take away is about understanding change and observing, being a vigilant observer for change and recognizing change in all of its forms. Most patients who come to see me, and just in general, change happens in a variety of ways, and usually what people observe is either a change in function, a change in memory, or a change in behavior, or some combination of all of those things. But what you need to be doing as caregivers and loved ones of individuals with intellectual disability is just keeping your eyes open and looking for change and trying to understand what components might be driving that, which is what we're going to delve into a bit more in the following segments.
The common theme for patients as they grow older is change, as I've said in other slides, but this is really the common theme that brings patients to see me in clinic and also might bring individuals to see other specialists, is that, quote, something's different. That's really the common theme. Something's changed, and that's what's led the person to seek additional help. And the real challenge then to the individual who's seeing that person is trying to understand the root cause of that change, trying to unpack everything that's going on and figure out which pieces might be driving this. And understanding aging is all about understanding and recognizing change in an individual. There are facts that you can memorize, and there are different statistics that we can learn related to growing older. But really, the main takeaway of this webinar is about recognizing change and having a little bit more framework around how to observe and understand change as it occurs in individuals that you might be caring for. So when we think about change over time, what I always say is when I see somebody in an office setting and they're there for a consultation to understand what might be changing in an individual, we are already at point B. So for me to understand what has occurred in this individual to lead us to that point that everybody is already identifying as a change, we need to go back and historically recreate what point A was so we can understand the mechanism that led from point A to point B. Being able to do this in a systematic way helps everybody, including the provider who's being asked to see the individual, to better understand which components are changing, what specifically is happening to that individual that everybody has observed, and helps us drill down what next steps need to be taken to better understand and assess the change. So when evaluating change in adults with intellectual disability, there is nothing more important than history. History is the most important thing in understanding what might be going on with the individual. So some specific challenges that might come up to the history taking is, probably most importantly, who is the historian? So it's important if you are trying to communicate changes to a provider in a healthcare setting that you bring somebody to the visit who really knows the individual well. Not just the person who's available that day and can make the drive, but who is able to really speak to the changes that they've observed, preferably with their own eyes, maybe over a span of time, so they can really talk about the changes from what they felt was the person's baseline to what they are noticing now. Again, sometimes this is easier said than done, and that's related to high staff turnover and the fact that there might not be a variety of people to choose from who've known the individual for a long period of time. But it's important to do your best to really try to make that happen because it really does empower that history-taking process. This relates to that lack of longitudinal relationships over the lifespan, as I've mentioned before. And the fact that medical record keeping can be inconsistent for people, especially those who are currently in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. So if there's not a person who can provide a verbal history of what's happened with the individual, there's often not a detailed medical record that goes back to really speak about the individual if the companion who's with the person is not capable of doing that themselves. The other barrier is also the lack of accuracy of an original underlying intellectual or developmental disability diagnosis. So there may also be some clues that we might be missing because we did not fully understand if the individual had a specific syndrome or condition that was related to their intellectual disability. So we would be able to have a better sense of what common conditions to look for if that was the case. So getting back to understanding and assessing change, the importance of a historic baseline cannot be overemphasized. And again, gets back to this idea of point A. So putting on hold all of the things that we're seeing as change, but really going back in time and getting a good description about what was this individual like at their very best. Describe what it is that this person was typically capable of doing on a daily basis, the highest level of independence they were able to achieve. And it's important to go through this in a little bit more of a systematic way so you don't miss anything. This is a general framework that I use when I assess patients, and it's these 7 components. The first being basic function, which relates specifically to just basic self-care skills: walking, eating, bathing, toileting, dressing, and grooming. Building on that would be skills that they've achieved throughout their lifetime, starting first with perhaps academic achievements, capabilities related to reading, writing, math, money skills. Once the individual became an adult, did they have employment? Were they competitively employed in the community, or were they always somebody who worked either in a sheltered workshop, or were they always a member or client of a day hab program or a day program? What was their ability around the house to perform household chores? Any other abilities or talents they might have had? Hobbies, sports they participated in? Any level of detail around that that really speaks to what the individual was able to do on a daily basis is so critical to understanding this point A. The next point is related to memory and giving a good description about what the individual was capable of from a memory standpoint. Were they somebody who was always able to remember names of individuals in their lives? Did they have an understanding of what day of the week it was and what the date was? Did they know a flow of a daily routine and a daily schedule and have an understanding of recurring events or holidays? Were they somebody who had good navigational skills in familiar areas? Did they have a good memory for upcoming events? So information that was provided in a short-term fashion, such as, don't forget, I'm going to pick you up for the dentist tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Or, what did you have yesterday when you went out to lunch with your friend? That type of short-term recall is important to understand at baseline, because that's often what is spoken about as a potential change for memory in later life. Understanding behavioral issues throughout lifetime, so what was typical behavior. This is also important in understanding whether or not later in life a behavior is actually a re-expression or a re-emergence of an old behavior, and what things the individual has done throughout their entire lifetime. What would be a typical pattern for that, and what was typically a trigger for those behaviors, if there was ever one that was identified. Understanding baseline language abilities, which would relate to both expressive ability, meaning the ability for an individual to make words and express themselves verbally. And if they didn't have expressive language through speech, whether or not they were able to learn sign language or develop another means of communication through pointing or gesturing. And then what their receptive language abilities were like, meaning how were they able to hear and understand spoken language, follow instructions, answer questions. Understanding the individual's personality at baseline helps describe a more richer picture of that person's personhood and what their typical patterns were like along those lines. Were they social? Did they have good peer friendships? Did they really prefer structure and routine? Did they tend to be stubborn if they didn't get their way? Any level of detail along those lines is helpful. And mood is really describing exactly that. On a daily basis, what was a typical mood like? Were there highs and lows? Were things changing rapidly, lots of mood swings? Or was the individual generally upbeat, friendly, happy? Did they tend towards anxiety or depression? Anything that would really describe typical mood throughout the lifetime. Once that's been well understood or well described, then we generate a description that really follows that same pattern, but in present day. So then we have more of a understanding of our point A, so we can then go ahead and generate point B and compare and contrast the differences. The impact of age-related changes. This is getting back to the topic we had discussed about understanding change over time. Point A and point B are what's created through discussion with the individual and the person who knows them well, the person or a group of people who know them well. So point A is really what's described as the person's baseline, what's been typical throughout their entire lifetime, and point B is what is being observed in current day. So here is just a scheme that would help you understand, hopefully, a way in which getting this level of detail and then thinking about them side by side helps you understand the way somebody has changed and really paints a clearer picture about the degree to which certain things might have changed in an individual. In this example, the individual at a functional level was independent in all self-care, and by the time the person was seeing you, needed assistance with bathing and dressing. For skills, they might have worked competitively and could read and write, and now it's being observed that the work is declining and there's discussion about considering transfer to a day hab setting. Memory at baseline might have been excellent for names and birthdays and phone numbers, and now you might be observing that the person is forgetful of daily schedule or unable to learn new names of staff. From a behavior standpoint, it might have been described that the person was occasionally acting out when he or she didn't get what they wanted. And now you're seeing that there's increased aggression at times of self-care, attempting to hit and swat at staff. Language skills might have been described as very good and expressive, or very good expressive and receptive skills, but now there's word-finding difficulties and speaking in just short phrases instead of full sentences. Personality might have been described as charming, loves people, loves social activities, and now you're seeing that individual is less outgoing, preferring to spend time in his or her room. And mood might have been described as generally happy or upbeat and easygoing, and now we're noticing that we're more moody or quick to anger. This is just a scheme where I've shown changes across all domains, but you can see if you think about other examples how certain things, when taken piece by piece, might actually show that there's really truly very good stability along certain lines between point A and point B, and it helps point out exactly which areas are really showing the most dramatic change, and it helps point you in the right direction of where you need to be looking. When I think about trying to put together a point A and point B story, I keep in mind this metaphor, it's the blind man and the elephant, where an elephant comes to the center of a village and there's blind men who are trying to describe the elephant, and each one of them is standing at a different portion of the elephant. And the one who feels his tail says, well, the elephant must be like a rope. And the one who feels his leg says he must be like a pole. And the man who feels the side of the elephant says, well, no, he's much more like a wall. Or the person standing near the ear says he's like a fan, and so on and so on. And the point is, none of them really describe the elephant at all. They all describe the individual piece that they were standing next to. And I think this is a good metaphor for how we think about putting together change and understanding that it's not one particular item most of the time, and really thinking about the big picture, all the different components that go into it. And it might take a group of people that you're discussing this with to put together the whole story.
Thank you, Dr. Moran, and thank you for listening. This is one training in a series of trainings about aging with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We look forward to seeing you again soon.